Hello again. Welcome to the second unit of our study as we begin to look at the life of Jesus and more specifically, how Jesus is revealed in the four Gospels. Have you ever stopped to wonder why we have four Gospels? We have four different recollections of who Jesus is, and each Gospel shows a different side of Jesus that we would not have if we just had one Gospel, for example. The Before we begin, one of the things that you might want to look at on the Moodle page for this session is there's a handout and a PDF file called the Synoptic Gospels. And you may want to print that out and make notes on it as we go through. And so if you want to pause and do that, that is certainly acceptable. And what we're doing here is we are basically showing should be a pretty brief session here, but we're going to introduce you to the Gospels. And I know some of you are scratching your head and saying, I thought all that introductory stuff was over. And it kind of is, but we do want to do a little bit more work here. Especially in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a new attention given to the analysis of the biblical text. And this was called textual criticism. And unfortunately, that is a name that has carried some negativity to it because, as you know, that when someone says, could I be critical for a minute? You think they're going to be negative. But if we really look at the word critic or criticism, it doesn't always have to be negative. For example, you might hear on a podcast or in a magazine, you might read a movie review, a movie critic, if you will. Well, the movie critic could be very praiseful of the movie, saying it's one of the best movies they ever saw, and this is why they believed it was one of the best movies they ever saw, and why you should go see it. And maybe we can do that one day if we ever get over this COVID and go back to the movies. But at least it might be direct stream, so you might want to know if you want to shell out the money to have it direct streamed. So a critic gives an analysis, and that's exactly what we have here with the textual criticism. To simplify, again, this is an introductory course and not trying to create any hardship for anyone, but just to kind of give you a sense of what this is about. There are four basic criticisms, and see if I can get this to come up. The first is historical criticism. What are the larger events occurring at the time that the text was written? And of course, that's exactly what we've been doing in this class up to this point, have we not? We've been looking at the Roman world, the Greek world, the Jewish world, the time between the Testaments. And so we have tried to paint a picture of what life was like in the first century, so that when we look at the stories and the people, we have an appropriate historical understanding of what was going on at that particular time. The second type of criticism is known as form criticism. And I'm going to save that discussion and the discussion on redaction criticism because they kind of go together. They're opposite ends of the same picture. And I'll do that in class. And I can do that a little bit more easily there in a conversational style with you where you can interact. The focus of this particular video that we're looking at as part of textual criticism and an introduction to the Gospels is we're looking at source criticism. That is, where does this material come from? And you already know from our historical criticism that over the development of the centuries, there were other Gospels that were written in the first century and in the early second century. So why these four Gospels? And more specifically, how do these Gospels differentiate themselves from the other Gospels? And where did this material come from? How do we trace this material? And so that leads us then to the understanding of what we said earlier, that we move from the oral tradition to a written tradition. And we come now to a term that you should be familiar with, and it's called synoptic. The word synoptic means to see together. And what we have here are the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are often treated in biblical New Testament work, scholarship, as a unit. And so we identify these as the synoptic gospels. And so, of course, immediately, one of the characteristics then of the Gospel of John is that the Gospel of John is not a synoptic. It does not fit into this means by which we see together. Now, one of the things that you might be interested in acquiring as you build your own New Testament library or your library at home in whatever shape or form that might take is a book called The Gospel Parallels. And I didn't cue this up very well, but here's the Gospel Parallels. And the main thing that you need to make sure that you're doing here is that you can see this is for the New Revised Standard version. And so you need to make sure that the Gospel Parallels you purchase are the Gospel Parallels that match the translation of your particular study Bible that you use on a regular basis. So if it's the King James or if it's the today's English version, make sure your Gospel Parallel matches that. And so what we have here, and this will become certainly much more clear as we move along, it lays out together, and I'll kind of get behind here and see if we can see this. For example, the story of the plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. You can see there on the bottom part of the page there that that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But the comfort for the weary is a story that is only found in Matthew. So what we immediately are able to see is that many of the stories that are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are parallels. And the reason that there are these parallels is because we believe that Mark was a source for Matthew and Luke. Now, this is going to get a little complicated. We're going to take our time. So please feel free to stop and think about some of these things or jot down a question that you want to ask when we meet together. And so this is the handout that I asked you to kind of pull out. And some of this is, again, what I call gospel Bible trivia. And I'll tell you when we're finished with all this exactly what you need to know, okay? So let's look here at this. First of all, we have three boxes. We have the Gospel of Mark, we have the Gospel of Matthew, and we have the Gospel of Luke. Now, what we believe is that the Gospel of Mark may indeed have been the first gospel written. And the reason for that is what we find in Matthew and Luke. Now, for example, here are, and again, this is what I call trivia, 661 verses in Mark, 1,068 verses in Matthew, and 1,149 verses in Luke. But look at the box here, and you see the arrow pointing down. 500 of the verses in Mark are found in Matthew, and 350 verses in Luke are found from Mark. And so if we go through and actually take the Gospels and lay them side by side and begin checking off each verse, what we find is that we're left with just very few verses, less than 10, that are not reflected in either Matthew or Luke. So think of it this way. Here I am, this is an English class, and you've all had an essay to do, and you've turned in that essay. And I find that 3 papers are very, very similar. And in fact, I find 2 of the papers are almost copying in whole part of this 3rd paper. And so I would be very suspicious, wouldn't I, about how this material was organized and who copied from whom because this material was there. So this is the identity. So I'm sorry. So because there is so much replication of Mark in Matthew and Luke, it makes us think that Mark was written first. And this is known as Markan priority. Markan priority. Well, as we continue to evaluate, what we discover is that 200 to 250 verses are in common to Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. You see that? So that tells us that there is another source that Matthew and Luke had access to. And in biblical scholarship, a lot of this came out of Germany with German scholars. This was called Q. Quelle is the German word for source. And so it's abbreviated just as Q. So in other words, to say it differently, there was a common source that we do not have access to, but Matthew and Luke had access to. And between the two of them, they drew 200 to 250 verses from this Q. So in the gospel parallel, when you find that just Matthew and Luke are listed and they're telling the similar story together, then you know you're probably looking at Q material. Well, that leaves a few other verses, does it not? We have 310 verses in Matthew that is unique to Matthew, and we have 580 verses that are unique to Luke and not found in Matthew. Okay? So, again, these biblical scholars and all their wisdom, they call this material that was unique to Matthew M, and the material unique to Luke was L. And so sometimes this is known as the four documentary hypothesis related to the Gospels, identifying the sources as Mark, Q, M, and L that brought about the composition of Matthew and Luke. And again, that leaves us then, where did Mark get his source? Well, we'll talk about that as we approach the Gospel of Mark. So I hope that's helpful to interpret the, at first glance, maybe a very confusing chart, but when you stop to think about it, it is quite easy to understand. Now, let's kind of do a little bit review and then kind of share a little bit why we think this is important. So we think, here's what you need to know. We think that Mark is the first gospel written. And so this is called Markan priority. All right? We believe that Matthew and Luke relied heavily on Mark, making Mark the first gospel that arrived on the scene. Q material, quelle or quelle, simply means source, that there was a common source for Matthew and Luke, and that M is identified as material unique to Luke, and I'm sorry, I said that wrong. M is material unique to Matthew, and L is material unique to Luke. Does that make some sense now? So if you know what M is, L is, Q is, Markan priority, then you've got this stuff pretty well down. Again, knowing how many verses are copied here and there, I think that's important information, but that's not important for you to have to carry around in your heads. But you know that that heavy reliance there. So let's think about this for a moment. Why is this important? Well, we're getting ready. The next section is to talk briefly about the birth and childhood of Jesus. Which Gospels do we read at Christmas time? Well, we don't read John. We don't read Mark. John begins his Gospel with this very esoteric kind of idea that Jesus existed at the time of creation. Sounds very much like Genesis 1. The Gospel of Mark begins with the beginning of Jesus's public ministry with the baptism by John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus. So it's only Matthew and Luke that gives us information about the birth of Jesus, the early childhood of Jesus. So stop and think a little bit more. Who was present at the birth of Jesus? Well, the only people that we know of was Mary and Joseph, and then Jesus. So where did these stories about Jesus's conception, Jesus's birth, Jesus's growing up, when we only have one story there, where's this material coming from? Well, it is coming from Matthew and Luke, but let's scratch the surface a little bit more. I asked you to read the opening chapters of Matthew and Luke in preparation for this video. What do you find from Matthew? You find from Matthew the perception of the story from Joseph, Joseph's perspective. Here's a quick footnote. Try to prove me wrong. Joseph never says a word in the Gospels. Joseph was probably one of the most important people in Jesus's life, and not a word is recorded that Joseph said. Isn't that interesting? When we turn to the Gospel of Luke, whose perspective do we have? We have the perspective of Mary. Here, Mary shares the visit by the angel saying that you have found favor with God and you're going to conceive a son who will be known as the Messiah. So you have two very different things. And again, if we go with tradition, Matthew, very patriarchal, a Jewish document written to a Jewish community. Well, the father is the most important role there, right? Luke, tradition says, was a physician, and he was interested in all things medical. Would he would have been interested in the birth of Jesus? Very much, probably. So both Luke and Matthew obtained sources. Where do these sources come from? We don't know. I mean, we can make a case that either we have an oral tradition that's been handed down that Matthew, the writer of Matthew, the writer of Luke, was able to access, or maybe, at least in Luke's case, and I can create a scenario, but it's hypothetical, that maybe Luke interviewed Mary. Is that possible? Sure. Is it possible that Mary had told somebody and that Luke had interviewed that person? Possibly. So when we stop to think about what is this L material, what is this M material, it becomes quite fascinating as we contemplate all of the opportunities there. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. And what I'd like to do is just kind of preview this unit a little bit about where we're going and what we need to focus on. Basically, we're looking at a two-step process. And what we're going to be doing is looking at the unique features of each gospel, because as I said at the beginning, we have 4 unique gospels. And unfortunately, what we have done in our study is we've kind of taken the gospels and thrown them into a blender. And whenever we want a little bit of Jesus, we just pour out a little bit of Jesus from what's been mixed together. But each gospel is telling the story of Jesus in a different way. And I want us to come away from that appreciating that perspective. With Mark, we have probably the greater perspective here of just who was Jesus and how Jesus was misunderstood and misrepresented. Matthew is jam-packed with the teachings of Jesus, and a lot of those teachings are in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. And so we'll be looking at some of those teachings as well as others. Luke emphasizes the kingdom of God, and that's something that Jesus really focused on. And Luke contains a good many of Jesus's parables, and the parables are an insight into the kingdom of God. And then John just takes us to a different place. And John identifies Jesus as more than as we were talking about earlier about the incarnation. John tends to focus more on the mystery of Jesus as Jesus being God, and using very highly symbolic and metaphorical language in describing who Jesus is. The second thing we will do after we finish kind of an understanding of Jesus's teachings and what he was about is we'll look at the passion of Jesus. 40% of the Gospels deal with the last week of Jesus's life. And so I will do exactly what I'm saying we shouldn't do. We will mix the Gospels together and we will try to color in each day of the week. We regard that as Holy Week as we try to understand what Jesus experienced in the last week of life with the death and resurrection. So that's where we're headed. So hopefully this was a good introduction to you and begins to whet your appetite for what is to come. And so I think I misspoke just a moment ago in this section for the next video. Certainly have read the introductory chapters there to Matthew and Luke, because we turn our attention now to the birth and childhood of Jesus. So until next time, take care, and I will see you in class hopefully soon. Bye now.